Thank you, Dr. Webb. I'm Mark Steele. I'm the chair of the Legislation Design Advisory Committee. I'm joined today by one of my fellow LDAC committee members, Matthew Smith, who is a barrister. A brief word for the information of committee members who may not be familiar with the work of the Legislation Design Advisory Committee before we speak to the submission. The Legislation Design Advisory Committee is mandated by Cabinet to advise on the consistency of bills with what are called the legislation guidelines, which are also developed and published by the LDAC. And these bring together a whole range of legal and constitutional principles. So our job is to focus not so much on the fundamental policy of bills, but on good legislative design, and especially the consistency of the proposals with the established principles of law and constitutional principles that are included in the legislation guidelines. There are about 20 of us on the committee all told. We are a mixture of public and private sector members who are appointed by the Attorney General. The Treaty Principles Bill for us raises three broad design issues, which we touch on in the submission. The first is fit with existing law and constitutional arrangements. The second is the very broad implications of these principles as they are stated in clauses 6 and 7 of this bill. And the third is the process that the LDAC think should be appropriate for the development of a bill with such wide-ranging constitutional significance. And I'll just speak briefly to each of those three issues. Firstly, there's already, as the committee is well aware, a large body of law, convention and practice regarding the treaty, which has been developed now by successive governments, the courts, the Waitangi Tribunal, over the last 50 years. And it's now reflected in New Zealand's common law, many statutes, treaty settlements, the cabinet manual, really throughout our government. The principles of this bill will, of course, affect that body of law and practice, but it will also be interpreted in the light of that body of law and practice. And it's quite unclear what the results will be in practice. The LDAC considers that it will be preferable to continue with the approach that we have used thus far and we're currently using, which is to tailor and develop law and convention about the treaty to the specific circumstances that we face, rather than trying to apply such a broad brush approach. That is the approach proposed by this bill. The second issue for us is that clauses 6 and 7 of this bill purport to control the effect of future legislation. This is both rare and constitutionally significant. Clause 6 also purports to limit the powers of Parliament and the Executive in a way which is significantly different from what is currently contained in the Constitution Act 1986. And this will lead through litigation to wide-ranging and unintended effects. The third broad point that we would like to draw attention to in our submission is that given the constitutional significance of this bill, the Legislation Design Advisory Committee would expect it to receive especially careful scrutiny and an extensive, inclusive process to be part of its development. In 2013, the report of the Constitutional Advisory Panel at that time made a number of helpful recommendations about the elements of such an approach. And the main ones are ample time, a non-partisan approach, participation which reflects both the treaty and New Zealand's demography, a comprehensive information campaign, and an exclusive and well-advertised set of opportunities for public participation. These are the kind of approaches that we used in the lead up to the Bill of Rights Act and in changes to our electoral system. They haven't been used here. And I think it's very important, given the wide implications of this bill, that a process along those lines is used. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. We've got some time for questions, and I'm going to ask one myself, if I may. Obviously, the bill suggests a referendum on these issues. Quite apart from the kind of nature of the legislation, can you comment on the use of referenda for questions of constitutional importance in terms of a useful legislative tool?
LDAC, Chair, doesn't have a view on the use of referenda themselves. That's a matter for Parliament and governments of the day. What we would like to see before we get as far as a referenda are the kind of steps and the kind of process that the Constitutional Advisory Panel recommended and has been used for those other constitutionally significant changes. We think it's very important that the ground be prepared in that way. Whether then a referendum is held is a matter for Parliament and governments of the day.
All right. Go to Steve Abel, and we should have time for Takata as well if we could.
Kia ora, thank you, Mark. I wonder how exceptional in sort of context of parliamentary processes or history is it for a government to allow such a flawed bill, as I would interpret it, with so many red flags, to make its way to first reading and then to select committee?
I'm afraid, Steve, I'm not a historian, so it's hard for me to answer that question. Part of the reason that governments use the Legislation Design Advisory Committee is as part of the process of subjecting bills to careful scrutiny. We would always recommend that bills go through a process of careful preparation before they get to the select committee stage. The select committee stage is a crucial part of scrutiny, but it's not the only part of legislation's development. And it's always a call for the existing government to make, of course, at what stage of development they decide to introduce a bill. But we recommend, and they're included in the legislation guidelines, the kind of steps that we're talking about now before you get to the select committee stage.
Takata?
Kia ora. Well, look, sort of in the similar vein as the other questions, my observation of Parliament is that it's actually not structured in a way that enables the voice of the treaty to be heard and then deliberated and considered well. And we could probably conclude that, after a long colonial history, that's probably not, that's probably, that's how it would be, of course. So there needs to be structural change. Do you have a sort of view around what type of structural change could be useful for making this type of conversation and this type of debate in the future a more quality conversation and debate?
The LDC doesn't have a view on the structural changes, but we do, as our submission says, have a view that a bill of the constitutional significance of this bill should work its way through the kinds of processes that I mentioned were recommended by the Constitutional Advisory Panel, and those have been used for other significant changes to our constitutional arrangements, like the Bill of Rights Act and changes to our electoral system. And we would expect those kinds of processes to be used for constitutionally significant legislation or legislative proposals.
Kia ora, thank you. Is there time for another one, Mr. Chair?
Yep, go Steve.
You use the term careful preparation as a reference to what any bill of this substance should have undertook before it got to the House. This bill hasn't had that careful preparation, is essentially what you're saying.
This bill certainly doesn't appear to have used the kind of steps that we've just worked our way through in this conversation.
All right, thank you for that, and thank you for being religiously apolitical. Well done, not an easy task today. And thanks for all the wider work you do that largely goes unnoticed by the general public, but I'm familiar with the stuff you do around legislative quality, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the submission.
Thank you.
I like this hidden Easter egg of a submission. It highlights so much while literally saying what's been said without saying what's been said.
Yeah, the chairman did a great job of that. Thank you to Mr. Steele for just bringing in a very pragmatic framework on that in terms of what hasn't been used in this process and what would be customary for something of this nature to work its way through. Yeah, really imperative point. You have to wonder, why did we just try and fast track this and push things through? Why didn't we slow things down and take the steps that we have used for consideration for things that have such a wider potential impact on others? So yeah, really good, robust discussion about structures, potential or the systems that should be employed, what we know is best practice in essence. Yeah, really good contribution.
And just for the note of one of our commentators, Kiwi Skirt, you've missed an absolutely fantastic submission. And I think you've got to go back and rewatch it. So it's just knowing the little bits that
Thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed to our Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Instagram, TikTok.